Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the TT Time with Dr. Tarver. It's a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. Welcome to the third week in October. We are celebrating Breast Cancer Awareness and Domestic Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. And the series this month is focusing on viewers' choice. So survivors have given me topics to discuss for this month. Week 1, we discussed being able to receive compliments. Week 2, we discussed healing from things and people that make us feel broken. And this week, this one is very personal for me. We will be discussing coping after a loved one dies from cancer. So this has been a bit of a tough week. This episode is dedicated to my classmate who transitioned on October 15th, which actually happens to be my birthday as well. She was a light, even in times of darkness that she may have experienced as she was battling cancer. And she had the uncanny ability to let people know that they were loved. She will be greatly missed by everyone who knew her. Rest in perfect peace, MC. I just want to go on record and say that cancer sucks. I know that you all have heard this before and may have said this before. And it is just something that robs us of so much. It takes children from their parents, parents from their children, partners from their loves, siblings, family, friends, co-workers, members of our organizations, our faith-based communities. There probably are very few people whose lives haven't been touched by cancer because it literally respects no one. It can come in quietly and just explode all over a person's life. And cancer alters us in so many ways, our bodies, our minds. It affects us economically, it affects us spiritually. I will never forget when my mother said she was so angry with God when she got diagnosed with cancer. It leaves its traces everywhere. And it is heartbreaking to watch someone you love go through treatment. It's devastating to learn that the treatment wasn't successful, or it was partially successful in that we got all of the cancer, it's removed from the lymph nodes, only to find out that it's going to metastasize somewhere else in the body, or it's going to come back later. Watching our loved ones transition is probably one of the worst feelings of helplessness, coupled with shock and grief. And you're watching your loved one just deteriorate sometimes before your eyes. Their weight can get down to a point where they almost just feel like they're a bone, or they're so swollen that their appearance is altered. You can't even really tell that's them if you didn't know it was them. They can have difficulty being able to communicate. They may be in and out of consciousness. They may be sleeping frequently. When they are awake, they might be confused. They might be restless. It might be hard to wake them. They can be anxious and fearful and lonely. They can experience hallucinations. Their conversations can be really disjointed. I remember my mother would say that she was seeing children, or she'd be seeing rain or water coming from the ceiling, and she would ask me if I saw it too. It was hard. It was hard to experience that. It was hard to experience the death rattle and the restless death, the death restlessness that comes over people, where they're moving, they're tossing, they just can't get settled, they're agitated because they know that death is at their door. And I think sometimes we just don't know what to do. Their, their lips may be dry, their skin may be bruised or pale, or them not being able to get comfortable, or wanting them to be able to at least acknowledge your presence, or for you to have some kind of acknowledgement from them that they're still in there. I think we're just constantly looking for those signs. All of the things that you didn't get a chance to say that you wanted to say, there can be so much guilt that's there. It may be very uncomfortable for people. Like a lot of times, people have a very difficult time just even sitting in the space of the room with someone who's transitioning, um, because they are just overwhelmed with so much emotion and it's difficult for them to see. And so they find themselves restless and pacing and they're leaving out. Some people aren't even able to come to the room. Some people wait until after they get the call that the person has transitioned. Then they're dealing with the guilt that they didn't come before they transitioned, even though maybe this loved one was asking for them. It can be all of the things that you want to kind of get in there when they are conscious and talking to them, all of the things that you want them to know, the reassurance from them that they know you love them, that they won't be forgotten. I know my mother, she didn't want to be by herself. I think she was quite fearful of dying alone. And so there's all of those things that I think we struggle with, particularly you go to the bathroom or you go run and have to do something and come back and they transition while you were gone. And so there's just all of these thoughts that come up. And then if they're children, and trying to figure out what's appropriate with regard to allowing their children to be in the space, particularly if they're younger children, but also, making decisions about whether or not we want children to see, their parents in their last days in this way and have that forever etched in their brains. But we think about parents whose children are transitioning, and that struggle of trying to be reassuring and be present, and meanwhile your heart is breaking, or your loved one is there and you're trying to be encouraging and lighthearted, but at the same time you're just having such a difficult time. It's difficult for you to be able to be in that space because it doesn't feel genuine. And then it feels like there's double grieving because I'm grieving as I'm watching you transition, but then I also have to have the grieving that occurs after you transition. So it can be very difficult to be in this space of watching our loved ones take their final breaths, have their final moments, particularly when you get a time frame, 3 months, 3 days, 3 weeks. Um, it can feel like a lot. And then, okay, what are we going to do? You struggle with, okay, do we need to talk about and make sure things are in place, like arrangements? Does that seem too grim? Maybe that doesn't feel like I'm being hopeful. I believe that God can do all things, but I'm also hearing that the likelihood of them being able to bounce back is not possible. And so there's just so many things that I think we wrestle with in those moments. And it can just be difficult to navigate all of those things. And I think that is probably another part of the struggle, even on top of being able to try to be present with this loved one in their last days. So, what do we do? Um, this list is not exhaustive, and I definitely encourage people to think about these things. I know that no one wants to have these kind of conversations. No one wants to speak with the power of life or death lies in the tongue. We don't want to speak things into existence, but we do have to be realistic and recognize that as sure as all of us live, there is going to be a time when we all transition as well. And so having some things in place can really help when that time comes so that at least some of these things won't have to be challenges. So here's a list of some things. We know there are a lot of physical changes. We know that people can lose control of their bladders and their bowels. Their lips can be very dry and cracked. Their skin could be very irritated. They may have difficulty getting comfortable. And so, just being mindful of things like chapstick or petroleum jelly for those dry lips, and adjusting lighting in the rooms, particularly if people are being really sensitive to light, or maybe you're finding that the room just feels very dark and dreary. Lightening the room up, bringing things into the room. I absolutely believe in scrapbooks and photo albums. We want to believe that our loved ones can hear us. So operating in that place so that we're talking to them and not about them in the space, sharing memories, particularly when they're lucid, And being able to, even though it's tough if they don't recognize you, being able to still be present with them in whatever memories they are having. Sometimes they will see people that have passed on already. And so just having conversations with them, allowing them to kind of talk through things, making sure that you're being very mindful of your tone and how you're speaking, because the calm, gentle tones, they really make a difference. And then it helps when people don't feel like they're alone and by themselves. So even if they're not responsive to you, you talking to them can be very comforting. Propping and positioning, so understanding the ways to sit people, particularly if they may be getting a lot of fluid drip, that may be causing them some discomfort when you hear that rattle, or what may feel like a person is choking. And so being able to work with the nursing staff, healthcare providers, to position them in ways that gives them some relief. We want to have, sealants and lubricants to protect skin, particularly if they're at a point where they may be in diapers. We want to make sure we have um, wet-proof kind of things on the bed, so that they don't get soaked through. We don't want them to be uncomfortable, and so sometimes to change their consistency of their stool can get really, sometimes like ice cream. And so just making sure that they're being changed regularly. But of course, their skin can get irritated. So ensuring that you're applying some things to kind of help protect their bodies when they are having that very loose kind of ice cream like stool. I think it's very important for us to recognize that people, may be thirsty but not necessarily able to drink a lot. So that's where the ice chips and the little sips of water or juice through a straw can be really helpful. um, Gently touching people, stroking their hands, caressing their hair, even rocking people, like just laying kind of rocking with them, particularly if you're able to do that if they're not connected to a lot of different things, and it's not going to be harmful to them in terms of there being maybe skin lesions or other stuff that they may be unfortunately dealing with as a result of their illness. But moisture to a room, so that can kind of help if they're having a lot of dryness or they're having some difficulty with breathing. Um, Being able to have the gospel music on or things that they might like jazz or R&B, right? So though putting those things in a room can really make a difference. I definitely think that making that space, right? Because we recognize, as hard as it is, this is this loved one's last moments. And so making that space be as comfortable and loving as it can be. Because sometimes when you're in a hospital room or you're in hospice, it cannot feel like home. And I think that's one of the things that makes people really uncomfortable, because they're thinking like, I'm not dying in this place where I've known safety and security, or maybe they are, but that's still scary for them. And so just kind of putting some things in the space to help them feel comfortable, to allow them to be able to recognize that they're loved, they're around people that love them, they're safe, and that you're there. Sometimes we, as hard as it can be, give people permission to leave, because sometimes they're holding on because they don't think we're going to be okay. And so we want to reassure them that we will absolutely um, have difficulty, but we'll be able to be okay. And we want them to be at peace. Because sometimes people just need to hear that from you, that they can let go. Um, we know it's going to be tough. You might be saying it in tears, but that is okay for your loved one to be able to go ahead and make that transition, because you want them to no longer be in that pain. I know that, again, we don't like to talk about this, but as much as you can do ahead of time is really going to help you for after the person transitions. So getting hospice set up, funeral arrangements, EMS, because it depends on where you are. If you're at hospice, they will take care of a lot of these things for you. But if you're at home, then you have to be the one that calls EMS, to let them know that the person is deceased. So you've got to get set up with the funeral home, all of those things. And so just kind of maybe having some people that you've identified who will be able to serve in those roles. And it is very good to have people do those kind of things, make the phone calls, make a list, go through and take care of that, because you and your grieving, you don't want to have to be dealing with that, right? And so making sure you have information about the insurance company, the attorney, the wills, what medical providers need to be contacted, or if you need a medical provider to be able to give information, having all of the things ahead of time that you'll need. For a lot of places, particularly if you're going to be thinking about cremation, there are some family members that have to consent to that before that can happen, particularly if that hasn't already been, those arrangements haven't been made with the funeral home that you're utilizing. Do they want to be cremated? Do they want a service? Where will the service be? What kind of things they want to have in place? And honestly, I do encourage people to talk with their loved one about that before they're getting to the place of transitioning. Sometimes we don't know what our loved ones want, and that may be because they weren't comfortable talking about it, but it also may be because they didn't want to make us uncomfortable talking about it. But again, that kind of information can be very, very helpful when you're trying to manage the transitioning phase of them while they may be in hospice or at home or in the hospital, but also after they transition. So, after they transition, stay with your loved one for a while. Don't feel like you got to get up immediately and get to business. One of the things that I really appreciated when my mom transitioned in hospice was the statement, stay as long as you need. Right? Because there were some things I needed to do. I needed to cry, get myself together, first of all, because it was a whole mess. But also because I needed to just say some things to my mom. I needed to talk with her and reaffirm for her how much I loved her, and reaffirm for my son was with me, for him that she was going to be with us. You know, getting that support from friends and family is very important too. Sometimes it may be helpful for, if you're a believer, to pray in that moment, to touch and agree to hold each other, to be around this loved one as you're saying goodbye. It's important that we acknowledge our pain. Death hurts. It hurts so bad. Even when you know it's coming, it still hurts. And so being able to acknowledge that and all of the different feelings that you will have, which is why it's important to understand the stages of grief and understand about grief prior to going through it. Here's your plug for a therapist. You can do that through therapy. It may be helpful to join a grief support group, even as your loved one is transitioning, because there are things that may be helpful from this group in preparation for your loved one dying. I think that it's so important for us to have a variety of different things, that there isn't just one thing that we need to look at. I think sometimes people think, okay, well, I'm just going to pray, I'm going to read scripture, or I've got my friends, or my family will be here, we'll grieve together. And they don't allow themselves to know what other options are available because everybody grieves different. And so you may be completely in a different place than another loved one. This may be your sibling, but as siblings, we experience grief different. We also have different relationships with our parents, with our children, with our spouses. And so that's why a variety of things can be really helpful, because you may find that some things work better than others, given whatever you may be feeling in a particular moment or the types of things that you may be dealing with. So allow yourself to feel. And I think it's important for us to write things down. You all hear me talk about journaling, but journaling allows you to just get all of the things that are in your head out. And it allows you to be able to work through some things. Like I said, sometimes we have guilt. There may have been unresolved conflict with this loved one. There may be things that we wanted to say and didn't say. There may be questions, all these things that may come up after this person transitions. And journaling can be a really good way to kind of sort through all of those things. But I also think it's important for us to have words of comfort around us as well. So songs, writings, that could be biblical writings, that could be books. One of the things that my mother did is she wrote inscriptions in a lot of my books. I don't even think I knew that she did it until I was going through books looking for things, and I would see entries in her handwriting that she made, and it gave me such peace. And I would just smile and, thanks, Mom. Right? So, words of comfort from clergy, it might be loved ones. You may know people who are just very loving people who have a good word. And they don't necessarily need to say anything in particular about the loved one, but just they have a way of speaking to you and being in a space with you that allows you to feel more comfort. So sometimes people don't have to say things, and I know that we struggle with what do we say to someone who's lost a loved one, or what do I say to people as I'm talking about my loved one that has transitioned? There doesn't have to be perfect words. Sometimes there don't even have to be words. Sometimes we just collectively sit in a space and we just are. I think it's also very important for us to recognize triggers because of the stages of grief. One includes anger. There is going to be a period of time where you are angry. You might be angry with God. You may be angry with medical providers. You may be angry with cancer. You may be angry with the hopes that you allowed yourself to have that didn't come to fruition. You may be angry with family members. There can be so many things that you can be angry about during this process. And so there are going to be triggers for you. And it's important for you to recognize those triggers so you can know how to manage them effectively. I will tell everybody good self care does not stop during the period of grief. And a lot of times, what ends up happening for people is we don't take care of ourselves. We're trying to entertain people. There's so many folks around, particularly right after we lose someone. Now, in those weeks and months following that, and we're by ourselves and in our heads, and no one's really checking on us in the same way, that's often when we will feel that isolation and all of the other emotions that can come, the loneliness, the anger may come then. And so being able to allow yourself to recognize that, hey, this is going to be this process. And so it's important for me to take care of myself, to rest, to stay hydrated, to eat meals, to take these breaks, take breaks from people, take breaks away from the business of grieving, because unfortunately death does have a business component too. All of those things we just talked about before, to get those affairs in order, and particularly if those affairs were not addressed prior to the person transitioning, that can be a whole other issue. Then there can be probate court and us because there wasn't a will. So, again, as much as you can do on the front end, that's really going to help you on the back end with regard to being able to allow yourself to grieve without having to attend to some of these other things. Don't throw yourself into stuff, right? Because a lot of times we'll throw ourselves into things to distract ourselves and not allow ourselves to fully feel and start the grieving process. So get realistic goals for yourself about what you're able to do, what you're ready to come back and do. And I know that a lot of us will throw ourselves back into work because we don't want to be idly at home with our thoughts. Some of you may live by yourselves. Some of you may be in a period of transition where your kids are leaving the house, and so you want some things to do. And that's fine, but just make sure that you're giving yourself space to process too. Okay, so recognizing the boundaries that are important for you to be able to put in place, and that includes with other people, because people can be very intrusive and ask a lot of questions or want information. Like sometimes people are just nosy. Sometimes people will suggest things to you that you don't necessarily want to do, that you're not ready to do, and this is why boundaries are very important, because you need to articulate to yourself first before you can articulate to other people what it is you're able to handle at this point in the grief process. And that can change from day to day. There may be moments where you wake up that day and you're like, yeah, I'm going to go and do this. By the time an hour before that event happens, or you're going to interact with somebody, you're like, yeah, I don't want to. Give yourself the grace of being able to change plans, and make sure that you are communicating to people, I'm not sure how I'm going to feel. So I'm going to tentatively say yes, but do know that I might change my mind. And it's important for people to be able to respect that. And they will, as long as you let them know. I have always found that a transitional object is very helpful when you have lost someone. Sometimes we just keep the oddest things. I kept my mother's glasses. I still have her glasses, and I have her Bible. One of the things I like about her Bible is she would write inside of it what her prayers were. And when those prayers were answered, she would cross them out. And so it is very comforting for me to be able to see all of these things that she prayed for that came to fruition. And that's a testament to her faith. She did reconcile with God, as we will do. We'll fall in and out of love with God and get upset with God. But as believers, we come back. And so that gives me a lot of comfort, and I think hope too, right? Because sometimes that hopelessness sets in, the helplessness can set in. So you're trying to figure out how you're going to live without this person. And so going back to things that they've said, things that they believed in, things that they did can be very helpful. But also allowing people to be able to pay tributes to your loved ones. You can create them as well. But I think sometimes when we hear how people were touched by our loved one, that also gives us hope and it gives us comfort. Um, and it continues their legacy. It keeps their names in loving memory. And I think that's one of the things that's important for us to, as we're in this grieving process, is we want to be close to this person that we loved. We know we won't physically be able to do that, but in the ways where we can create spaces to feel them, to see them, whether that's that transitional object or things done in memory of them. If you go to the graveyard to be close to them or whatever it is, or the urn, all of those things matter because sometimes you just want to feel their presence. And there isn't any limit to how you can feel them because they are everywhere around you. And when you need to be close to them, you just need to figure out how you're going to do that and what that's going to look like. And I think that's why talking to them can be really helpful. As you're having hard times, talk to your loved one. The amount of times I have asked my mother or my father um, to assist me, or I remember words that they said of encouragement or support or hope, it makes a difference. And so I think that for all of us, figuring out what that will look like does take time. And so I don't want you to feel like these are all things you need to do the next day after your loved one has transitioned. There's going to be a lot of challenges in the days after their death, the weeks after their death, and the months after their death. That first year is definitely a hard year. But then year 3 could be hard, year 2 could be hard. It just depends on a lot of things, the memories and moments that might be coming up, graduations or weddings or um, anniversaries or holidays. Like all of those things can be really challenging. Maybe we had a trip planned for 2 years out. It doesn't register with me until I start getting information about this trip from 2 years ago, right? And so there will be so many ebbs and flows to this process. So be kind to yourself in this journey. And that's why I think it's so important to understand the grief process and to have some kind of grief support, whether it's a grief group or a therapist to help you navigate. Sometimes it may be helpful to wait a little while after the person transitions, or as the person is transitioning can be really helpful. But immediately after the death, sometimes it's just too soon after to be able to be fully present in the grief process enough to work through it in therapy. So gauging that is really important too. I'll leave you with this. Your heart is going to hurt. There is absolutely nothing you can do about your heart hurting. But I will tell you that over time, the pain won't be as sharp. So, to everyone who has known the heartache of grief, may the memories of your loved ones live in your hearts and bring you comfort in times of darkness. Be well.